I've been looking at the race situation in America, and when I really examine it, I see the psychological dysfunction called codependency. What is codependency? That's when one group of individuals or one person depends on another person entirely for their sustenance. Codependent situation is like the alcoholic and his wife, or the battered wife and her husband. And when I look at black people, I see this, and white people, I see this situation. Some racist white people want black people to be completely dependent on them, and it's almost like a really dysfunctional family situation, like a small child and a dysfunctional father or a dysfunctional mother. This codependency, I really looked at it studying history. I looked at the Great Migration in the 1930s and the 1940s. I don't know if those periods are right, but just making this video off the ad lib. But the Great Migration that happened in the 20th century, they said that white people were pulling black people off trains. Um, that really was one of the most illogical things that I had ever heard of in my life. Um, Here's these racists saying they hate niggers, they hate black people, they don't like black people, they want black people to go away. But when the black people take action to go away, they're pulling them off the train. What is that about? Uh, that clearly shows a psychological disorder within these racist individuals. It really shows that it's like the psychological dysfunction of whites, or what we call racism and white supremacy. Um, what makes this psychologically disturbing is that if you say you want someone to go away from you and they leave, why are you trying to pull them back? This is just like the alcoholic whose wife leaves and who says she's leaving. She gets up and leaves, and then the husband tries to keep her from leaving. You said you wanted her to go away, you told her to get out, but here you are telling her, I don't want you to go. That's what codependency is. Like, I want to maintain power over this person and control over this person, and I don't, because if I want to maintain power and control over this person, but I don't want them to be an independent entity. And the same codependent pattern, if you look at it, followed the Rosewood incidents and the Tulsa race riots that destroyed Black Wall Street. These codependent individuals never wanted to they wanted to have power over black people, but they never wanted to see black people actualize their own potential. And I believe that they didn't want black people to actualize their own potential because it would show that the concept of white supremacy would be completely refuted and shown as a fundamentally flawed concept. And the people who bought into the concept of white supremacy would realize that they're not as great as they think they are. That this whole idea of white people being superior to all black people would be shown for what it is, a false ideology and a false social construct. And if they saw black people having their own businesses, having their own economy, having their own infrastructure, it would show many of these white people that they are truly mediocre. And I think a lot of people bought into white supremacy, like the alcoholic. They need to buy into that sense of superiority, that sense of power, and that they need that sense of control, and they need someone to control so they can have that sense of superiority. Um, this is my theory. It's not anything that can be truly stated by fact, but this is what I did studying psychology. Because when I'm writing books, I study a lot of psychology so I can get into the heads of the characters that I'm writing. But when I look at race, I really see this codependent relationship between blacks and whites. And on the flip side of that, of codependent relationship, I see on the black side, during the late 1960s, 1970s with the integration, I see the codependent relationship um, there. And with the integration, we see black people, instead of trying to build their own economy after receiving the civil rights, their rights from the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act by continuing to further participate in group economics. I mean, because if you really look at it, why do you have to go to Woolworth? Why do you have to go to the Barney's? What's so important about going to a white store? I mean, you now have, because civil rights, as I saw it, was about getting equal protection under the law and ensuring the safety of African Americans. I mean, making sure that the laws of the country were equal for all people. But black people bought into it and thought integration meant I get to shop with white people. Um, Again, that codependent relationship, believing that white is better, white is superior, and that I'm not powerful unless I'm validated by a white person. And if you really look at it, that's really what is the crux of the codependent relationship. White people believe that unless a white person, I mean, black people believe unless a white person says that they're valuable, they're not valuable. And that's why, as David Carroll put in his videos, the only time black people get upset is when a black person is killed by a white cop or a non-black person, because black people, we really don't value ourselves, and that shows in the codependent relationship many African Americans have, in the way they behave. I mean, same thing with the busing. If you look at the busing in the 1970s, in the 1960s, why do you have to go to a white suburban school? Right now you have the funding. I mean, the government gave you equal protection under the law and right and access to equal funds. Why not build up your own schools? But no, African Americans, believing that white is better, decided I have to go to a white school to get a better education. How about building up your own schools and making your own schools good for education? I mean, that's what the Jews did. Jews, they have their own schools. Asians have their own schools. And I'm seeing even the Catholics had their own schools. And they said, look, our schools are better than their schools. We're not going to these public schools in somebody else's neighborhood to say that it's better. We're going to make our own schools better. We're going to take the same funding and the same tax dollars and make our own community better. But African Americans felt, I have to be bussed out to somebody else's school. And that, again, behavior shows me the codependent relationship between blacks and whites. I mean, in America, I mean, there's clearly a codependent relationship. I mean, black people feel that they can't do anything without white people being there. That's what it's looking like to me. And white people feel like they need black people there. It's like both of them need this racism like a crutch. And when I look at the codependent relationship, that's what both people do. They're not supporting each other. They're just leaning on each other. And then they play this, what I call the shuck and jive, blame and shame game, where one makes an accusation at another, and then the other makes an accusation at another, and they keep accusing each other of doing wrong in the hopes of being a victim. And it's this hope of getting people to sympathize with them and feel sorry for them is where they play this, is why they play this game. They want somebody to feel sorry for them so they can launch their shaming tactics and get sympathy. And that's what I'm seeing in America regarding race. This whole shuck and jive, blame and shame game where they point fingers at each other. It's your fault. It's your fault. It's your fault. It's your fault. I see it in between political parties, and regardless of race or political party, Democrat, Republican, black or white, they just play this shuck and jive, blame and shame game where it's somebody's fault. It's always somebody's fault. And nothing ever gets done. Nobody ever wants to focus on a solution. It really is. That's what codependent people do. Codependent people don't want solutions. They just want to play the victim. They want someone to feel sorry for them. They want somebody to feel pity for them. And they want to keep things from getting done, because the reason why they want to keep things from getting done is because they don't want to take responsibility for themselves. That's the primary reason why the liberal and the Negro, as I see it, and even some of the conservatives, want to play this shuck and jive, blame and shame game. They don't want anything to get done. What they really want to do is keep you distracted, because that means they would have to take some responsibility for their own lives and be accountable for their own actions. So that's what codependent people do. That's what the alcoholic does. That's what the wife beater does. It's all her fault, and then she goes back at him and says it's his fault. And they keep pointing fingers at each other, and nothing constructive ever gets done. And that's what's happening in the African American community regarding race. We have this codependent relationship where black people, I'd say a lot of them depend on racism, and a lot of white people depend on racism. And they both need racism as their own tool to use to blame others. So they can keep blaming each other because neither side really wants to take constructive action to improve their lives. I mean, a lot of the people who are making like the, I'd say the big case many years ago, he was a guy, he was upset saying, affirmative action is keeping me from getting into college. And really, when he came into school, he couldn't do the work. He wound up quitting in the end. He went through all of this blaming and shaming, and what he did was he got this court decision where he got to go to this school, and then a couple months later he quit. And he said it was racism, and it really wasn't racism. It really was, I just didn't want to do the work. And many people, they don't want to do the work. I mean, many black people don't want to do the work, and many white people don't want to do the work. What they want to do is keep making these excuses and saying it's racism. I mean, I know that there's legitimate cases of racism because I experienced it at a couple of jobs I've had. But the legitimate cases versus the old shuck and jive, blame and shame game is a totally different scenario. I mean, what we have in America is this codependency, and the codependency really is dragging us down because when I'm looking at the bigger picture, the broader picture of America, and the Chinese are getting ready to beat the crap out of America. The Middle East, in spite of all the turmoil, they are in better economic shape than America. Racism is really keeping America from being competitive. And this codependent relationship between blacks and whites and other peoples, because the whole concept I say of white supremacy really is codependency. When people have to depend on one person, it's not a good situation. And that's why codependent relationships are dysfunctional. You have one person who believes everybody has to depend on them, but that prevents everybody from growing. It prevents people from taking account of themselves, taking responsibility for themselves, and really making the steps that they need to take to themselves to the next level. Because as long as the codependent person is there, both parties have, as long as one is dependent on the other, both parties have an excuse not to do what they need to do in their lives to improve the quality of their life. I mean, that's what happens when you have a codependent relationship. Nobody feels that they have to take responsibility for their actions. Nobody feels they have to take responsibility for themselves. And it's leading to a lot of people being mediocre. It's leading to a lot of people having a sense of entitlement on both sides, black and white, that nobody is really wanting to pick up and do the heavy lifting. Nobody just wants to go out and do the hard work that is necessary to get themselves to the next level. You have a lot of people they just sit there and go, oh, it's somebody else's fault, because that's part of what codependent people do. They always look for somebody to blame so they can avoid doing what they need to do. Because a codependent person's whole mantra is, I'm a victim, and because I'm a victim, that means I don't have to do anything. I mean, I've seen the same dysfunctional victim pattern. It's just permeated throughout America, and it's just getting worse. We really have to look at race in a different light, and this is one of the things I like to do. I've done a lot of my writing and research, and I've been looking at it. I did a whole blog on this about a year ago called Racism and Codependency. We really have to look at the psychological dysfunction we have to look at race as a psychological disorder. I mean, racism, I look at it, there's something seriously mentally wrong with people who are racist. I really do believe that they have severe disorders of some type, because if you have to blame somebody else for your problems, that's messed up. I mean, sometimes you do run into situations where somebody causes a situation, but then you find another solution. You always find another way. But with this codependent person, somebody else is always at fault. And somebody else, and when you have that type of mindset and that type of thinking, all it does is hold you back. And I really believe that racism is like a form of codependency. And doctors, psychologists really need to start seeing it that way, and we really need to start examining it that way, because the only people who, the only way to fix a problem, I'm going to say, the only way to fix a problem is to acknowledge it, and we have to acknowledge that there has to be some sort of mental health component to racism. I mean, I look at it as it's a culture that was that's transmitted by by mothers and mothers to each generation, and it's not a constructive culture. I look at it as something that really needs to be dealt with, and we really need to start doing it. Part of it, not just with an educational component, but with a mental health component. Because hating someone for no reason and blaming people for your problems is not functional behavior. It's not mentally well people don't blame other people for their problems. They go out and try to find ways to solve their problems. They don't blame people for not getting promotions and stuff. They just go find another company to go work at, or they go find something else to do. Um, when I look at the black community, I see the codependency. I really do, because every time you talk to a black person, it's always somebody else's fault. And when you talk to some white people, it's always somebody else's fault. And nobody, when you tell them to take a constructive action, they shut it down, or they give you an excuse. There's never any attempt to say, look, this is my life, I make these decisions, and that who I become at the end, at the point in my life is based on the sum of all my actions. And I don't hear that from a lot of Americans, because I believe, like I said, racism is codependent. And codependent people, they never look at life and say, I am the sum of all my actions. It's based on the decisions I have made. I'm not saying racism doesn't exist, but I'm saying that there's a psychological component we really need to examine, and we really need to take a long, hard look at why these people, because are thinking this way, because the way they're thinking is fundamentally flawed. You can't blame somebody else for your problems. I mean, like when I look at the whole Barack Obama situation, I know he's an ineffective and incompetent president, and I hold him accountable based on his actions. But there are people saying, oh, these racists talking about they hate Barack Obama because he's a black man. And I'm like, but most white people voted for him, and most Hispanics voted for him. It wasn't. I mean, if you voted for him, you can't get mad. It's the craziest thing. He didn't get elected president just by black people. I mean, he got 98% of the black vote, but it wasn't just black people who voted for Barack Obama. So it's ridiculous to say I hate him because he's the black president. I mean, that's the craziest thing I have ever heard. And it's like, I hear a lot of crazy, illogical things. It makes no sense. It just makes no sense at all. And it's utterly insane, and we really, really have to, again, look at the psychological makeup of racism on both the black side and the white side, because the issues of race, this codependency, is keeping the country from growing, is keeping us from being competitive, it's holding the country back. I look at racism as the one thing that's really choking the life out of the country and keeping people from growing, keeping American people from growing. I mean, I'm not saying that people are going to get along, I mean, because that's the way it is. People are going to disagree, they're not going to dislike each other, but the whole blame and shame game is not helping the country at all. And that's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, subscribe.